Hello there and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the L24's daily special coverage. I'm your host, Abdurrahim Kashur, and today's focus will be on Russia-Ukraine latest in the ground, as well as the US new aid package to Ukraine. Ukrainian forces have counted more gains on the battlefield, with President Volodymyr Zelensky hailing more good news from the front lines. In this nightly address Tuesday, rapid and significant gains have been counted in Ukraine's counteroffensive in the south, in particular with advances in the Kherson region. Moscow's hold on the four next territories look increasingly tenuous and shaky, with none of the regions fully occupied by Russian forces. On the other side of this conflict, US has committed even more firepower to Ukraine's fight. The Biden administration announced another $625 million in military aid to Kyiv Tuesday. In a call with Zelensky, President Joe Biden said that the US would never recognize the illegal annexation attempts. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by our distinguished analyst, Mr. Howley Schlenger, Vice President of the Schiller Institute from Germany. And for the first time in the show, I'm joined by Tiago André Lopez, Professor of Diplomacy at Portucalense University in Portugal. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us in this debate. A short break and we start our discussion. And before we delve into our discussion, let's tackle this report. A brigade of Ukrainian Marines appears to have expelled Russian forces from town in the country's south on Tuesday, in a sign of continuing momentum in Ukraine's counter-strikes against the Russian army. The Ukrainian strategy of attacking at two locations at once in south and in the east came into focus a month ago and has left Russian forces off balance and losing ground.
The Russian reservists have arrived to the front line, an attempt to boost the military presence in the four freshly annexed regions. But the scale of the Ukrainian advance is remarkable. Zelensky's forces have liberated a key village in the southern region of Kherson, hastening in another Russian military retreat.
The Ukrainian army is advancing quite quickly and powerfully in the south of our country, as part of the current defense operation.
In the past 48 hours, Ukrainian forces have pushed south along the Dnipro River, while Russian units say they have pulled back from several settlements in the north of Kherson region as well. This rapid advance of the Ukrainian military is a bit too much for the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who accused neighboring Ukraine of sending 15,000 troops to the border area to build defenses and conduct reconnaissance, actions that he called provocations.
In a word, not only has Ukraine barricaded itself in, but has built a wall. They are constantly conducting optical, radio electronic, and radio technical reconnaissance of our territory. Troops and strategic sites often using drones that have violated the state border. And at the same time, they are concerned that, don't let Belarus enter the war, and there are constant provocations at the border.
Зачастую с нарушением своими беспилотниками линии государственной границы.
Only last week, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who rules a nuclear power, said the next region would be Russian forever. He repeatedly cautioned the West that any attack on Russia could provoke a nuclear response.
So, starting with you, Mr. Howley, Putin is still calling for Ukraine to start a new round of negotiations. But Zelensky, even though he is committing huge losses as his country is being divided, he is still determined not to negotiate, a fact that underlines one question: when we will see the end of this crisis and how it's going to be.
Well, I think it's very difficult in any war on a day-to-day basis to proclaim a tide-changing victory. We're seeing the effects on the Russian side of being spread too thin. We're seeing the effects on the Ukrainian side of having access to significant offensive weaponry from NATO. So the pullback by Russian forces is not the end of the war or even the beginning of the end. And I think any sense that that's the case is mistaken. Now, the Russians are continuing to say they're prepared to negotiate. So far, Zelensky has refused. It's clear that in March and April of this year, there was a serious process of negotiations which could have included a ceasefire and an end to the war. But NATO sent Boris Johnson in to tell Zelensky, you have to keep fighting and we'll give you more weapons. Now, I think this is a catastrophic decision. The ground that's being won in eastern Ukraine is being won at tremendous levels of casualties on both sides. But the Russians have made clear they're not going to back off. Now, if Zelensky's not going to negotiate and reject any offer from Russia to negotiate, this can continue for quite a while. The question is, can the Western forces sustain the level of commitment to provide arms and support for Ukraine under conditions of extreme problems with the winter weather, the energy shortages, economic crises, and a growing dissatisfaction with governments in the West? So I think we're still at a point where it's too early to say where this is going. I hope it's not one of these never-ending wars, because if so, everyone loses.
Very good points you have raised. Mr. Andrei, coming to you. Ukraine's advances pose one question for the whole world. Can Kyiv actually win? Some analysts now confirm that it was a strategic retreat by the Russians to claim these 4 territories without losing men, by only using these referendum votes that were in favor of Moscow's cause. In your opinion, why Putin now is calling for negotiations? Why he can actually make more advances? Is it a sign of getting tired, or this is a new strategy?
Okay, so negotiations are always a question of having what we call appetite to negotiate. And what we have right now, this is not new. Moscow and Kyiv at different times have been asking for negotiations. Of course, that this new call for negotiations on the side of Russia was to gain time that Russia needs in order to deploy the troops that he has mobilized recently and that he has still to train. So there was, of course, a strategy to gain time. I do have to, however, concur with the previous analyst in 2 things. A, these advancements on the field are extremely costly, but more than that, the political landscape in Europe is changing, and I do feel that we are not looking to it as much as we should. We cannot ignore that on Sunday we had elections in Bulgaria, and the main victory parties were parties that are mostly pro-Moscow, or at least sympathizing with Moscow positions. So Bulgaria's upcoming cabinet could be a cabinet that will align itself with Hungary and will offer robust opposition to the Commission's packages. Even if the aid package was today approved, this package that was approved today is a lower version than what the Commission wanted. This is one side. On the Kyiv side, however, there was a surprise, and to me this was not a positive surprise. This decree of President Zelensky that he does not want to negotiate with a particular person, because the decree is clear. They are willing to negotiate with Russia, but not with Vladimir Putin. Now, 2 things are called into question, and I do feel that we need to ponder. A, if the president of Ukraine does have the legal, moral, or political authority to decide who presides another country, which of course he doesn't. Even if on an ethical point of view we can agree or sympathize with him, on a political and legal point of view, the fact is that Vladimir Putin was elected president on elections that were mostly agreed that they were valid and they were significantly done according to international standards. That's one side of the issue. The other issue is this. There is no sign whatsoever that the upcoming president after Vladimir Putin would be less militaristic or would have a different geopolitical vision of the world. One of the gentlemen that is aligning itself to be a successor to Vladimir Putin is the defense minister Shoigu, and we do know the defense minister is a more hardliner. If he was in charge, probably we would have seen already arms on the ground with more significant destruction power. And today there is another information that we do need to take into account. For the first time after 2 weeks, Russia is starting to speak about stabilizing the front lines. So this means that the counteroffensive momentum of Kyiv might be stalled in the upcoming days.
Quite interesting. Staying with you, Mr. Andre, and derived from Mr. Howley's words, will the Westerns keep that commitment to aid Ukraine? Because taking into consideration Europe is witnessing a crisis in all fields, I believe only US is doing this, I believe, aiding Ukraine with weapons and money. But the real questions, don't you think that the EU will be divided after this war reaching end?
The EU is already divided. This 8th package showed that very clearly, and even the 6th package. If you remember the 6th sanctions packages of the EU, it took 1.5 months more than was initially expected for the EU to be able to negotiate it. And that package had a couple of escape routes. It had a couple of opt-out mechanisms for countries like Slovakia, Hungary, and Czech Republic. And so we already are seeing that. What we are also seeing are two other phenomena that will impact the war, and I do feel sometimes that in Kyiv, these phenomena are not being properly read. Number one, exhaustion by Western audiences about the war. The Western audiences, particularly the ones who do not share a border with Ukraine, speaking from Portugal, this is something we are starting to see. They are starting to link off the war and looking to other issues as more relevant. Now, particularly that inflation is rising, power of purchase is decreasing. So this is one phenomenon. The other is this, and this will be, I feel, more interesting. The more inflation rises, the more economic difficulties come, and the less significant advancements we see on the ground, because even with all the advancements that Ukraine has made, and they are significant, the fact is that Russia still holds around 14 to 15% of Ukraine's territory. We are speaking of a territory that is roughly the same size as Portugal or Serbia or Jordan, and so we are not speaking of a territory that is small. And in terms of energy dependence, countries like Portugal that import their energy from African providers like Algeria or Nigeria, we are on a different position, but most countries in Europe have a high degree of dependence on Russia, and I think this is not being taken fully into account. Now, particularly that the OPEC has announced that they are planning to cut the production of oil. Saudi Arabia, Russia, and United Arab Emirates.
Very good indeed, Mr. Andre. Keep this point in mind. We will come through it. Mr. Howley, before giving you this question, let's tackle the second topic. The Russian President Vladimir Putin signed into law 4 unification treaties with the Donetsk and Lugansk People Republics, as well as the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. The annexation of 4 regions was strongly condemned by Kyiv as its Western allies, with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky responding by announcing a fast-track application to join NATO. Mr. Howley, more than 95% of votes in the separatist regions supported Russia overall. Putin then authorized the annexation of these lands with his signature on a decree. At the time, Ukrainian forces took control of Lyman city, a key strategic location in the Donbass. So, to this point, do you believe that a true safe zone will exist in these new Russian regions? Will the locals over there get the chance to have a normal life?
Well, one would hope so. I want to start by just saying I agree with most of what Professor Lopez said in terms of the question of the loss of support for this war in Western Europe. I live in Germany, as you know. In Germany, there's growing demonstrations, not quite the size of the Czech Republic yet or Belgium, but they're growing. And I think the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines is going to have an enormous impact on German citizens who are marching under the slogan, "Open the Nord Stream 2." Now it appears, for the time being at least, that's impossible. So the cold, dark winter will change the perception in the West. Now, under those circumstances, can Ukraine continue the military advance? I don't think so. And I think when the Russians bring more troops in, and the Russians have not yet utilized most of their heavy weapons that are available, I think the situation could become much more tragic for the people of Ukraine. I think the stubborn insistence of Zelensky that he won't negotiate is a real problem and could cause a problem for him with his own population. So as to whether this situation can be resolved in the long term, it has to be. Here's the problem. Why are no governments in the West calling for negotiation? Mm-hmm. We'll see what happens with Italy. We'll see what happens with Bulgaria. That's an interesting case. In the United States now, there's just quickly one point that's being made. We're starting to see congressmen break the uniform bipartisan commitment. And one of the things they're saying is, why are we providing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to arm Ukraine when the families of American servicemen and women have to go on food stamps to get government support to feed their children? This is a growing point of anger in the United States, and I think the situation will shift in the United States in the period ahead.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed. Thank you so much, Mr. Halley. Mr. Andrew, we all witnessed the last couple of weeks the referendums in the Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions ended in favor of Moscow's cause. However, one may inquire, does Russia have the legal right to hold this referendum, or this is another violation of international law by Putin, as the West is claiming? If so, how can you explain the people's will if they really want to join Russia rather than being Ukrainians?
These are a lot of questions, and I'll try to be as simple as possible in all of them. So, in terms of recognizing the statehood of Donetsk and Luhansk, yes, Russia does have the legal authority to do that, because that has been decided, and there is no other process that I know in international law, that this is a unilateral decision of any state. So states can recognize other entities that claim statehood. This is the reason why some states, for example, recognize Kosovo and others don't. Some states recognize North Korea and others don't. So this is a unilateral process, and in that, there was no violation of international law, as some Western states, wrongly so, have claimed. The right to do a referendum, so the right for self-determination, it's also inscribed in international conventions that people have the right to self-determination and political self-determination. This is, however, more complicated in the case of these 4 referendums because of this. The referendums have an impact over population that is not under the control of Russian administration. So the referendums are disposing for the future of population that was unable to participate. That's one problem. The other problem, of course, was that the referendum was done on extraordinary circumstances that were carried with the army, on a transparent ballot box, with most of the votes open. But on these, I do have to call the attention on another thing. De facto, the numbers that Russia released are probably, and they open the prospect for some level of manipulation, but we cannot ignore the fact that on a regular referendum, there would be a big possibility that the yes would win on a break between 55% to around 65%, as pro-Russian parties have done in the past in parliamentary elections in Ukraine. And so the regions do have the right to do these referendums, because if not, then what Kosovo did unilaterally in 2008 would also be illegal.
Perfectly understood. Now let's tackle another topic to have a really fruitful debate. The US announced plans on Tuesday to provide an additional $625 million in military aid to Ukraine, a package that includes additional advanced rocket systems credited with helping the country's military gain momentum in its war with Russia. President Joe Biden provided details on the latest package, which includes high mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, artillery systems, ammunition, and armored vehicles in a call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Same with you, Mr. Andriy. Europe is facing a huge energy crisis. It's a dilemma. But instead of helping the EU countries to find a better solution, the US is putting all the money in Ukraine's port-freighted pocket, all the eggs in one basket. Do you believe that the US government is waging this conflict in vain? I mean, they could help EU countries to recover with this money.
It's always a tricky choice, and of course, in this case, particularly in this case for Biden's administration, this is a very pressing momentum. We cannot ignore this fact. We have a midterm election coming to the U.S., and the midterm election will now, since we are already in October, will start to shift some of the senators' commitments to the war in a moment when the economy in the U.S. is also struggling a little bit. But it is, of course, a tricky choice, particularly for these European countries throughout the summer, from May until early September, have been looking for alternatives to gas and oil consumption. They have been looking to countries like Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, or some African countries like Nigeria as options. They've also been looking for solutions like pipeline solutions, going, for example, from Lisbon all the way to Berlin. Although right now that project has been stalled because France has not yet approved the routes passing through French territory. So there has been a lot of displays. But two things come into action when we speak of displays. Number one, the argument given that we are not going to pass more oil and gas to Russia because this is a non-democratic state. Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan have a lower degree of democracy, or if you want, have a much higher degree of authoritarianism and autocracy on their regimes. So this is a non-issue. If democracy was an issue in terms of energy, then Europe would have to resort mostly to
Mr.
candles.
Andrew, I'm sorry to cut you train of thought, but as a direct question, with a direct answer, do you think that US is fueling the war right now with this package, sending weapons and money? That's all.
Okay, so it is at least keeping the war afloat. If it wasn't for these enormous packages to Ukraine, of course, Ukraine's capability to fight would be lowered and decreased.
Understood. Mr. Hawley, some analysts describe EU sanctions policies on Russia as a suicidal policy because they are viewed as a double-edged sword, as Mr. Hussein Askari said, your teammates in the Schiller Institute. And the whole European continent now is suffering from these sanctions. So why would they impose another set of sanctions? Don't you think it's already enough? And honestly speaking, how can you explain this unbelievable spending of the United States in a time of increasing inflation all over the world, even in US? Would the ex-president Donald Trump follow the same policy as ongoing Biden administration?
Well, I'll come to Trump in a second, but I think the point you're making is very relevant. What's the goal of the US policy? Is it really to provide democracy and freedom to the courageous people of Ukraine? Well, if so, why did the US sponsor a coup in February 2014 to overthrow a democratic government? I find it so hypocritical to hear talk about the referendum as a sham and we need to support our democracy when you look at the fact that Zelensky won his election promising to follow through on the Minsk Accord to give more autonomy to the people in eastern Ukraine, and instead they continued to fight them. So there's hypocrisy. So what's behind this? Some people say, well, the U.S. is trying to sell more weapons. That's a simplistic answer. I think what Secretary of Defense Austin said in the Ramstein Air Base meeting the first time is the real reason. The U.S. is trying to weaken Russia. Russia came out of the shock therapy years of the 90s in terrible shape, forced to give up some of its raw materials and lose some of its sovereignty. That's when Putin came in, and Putin has tried to rebuild Russia. The idea of an independent Russia working with China, working with other nations of the global south to form possibly a new monetary system would spell the end of the unipolar era controlled by London and Wall Street. That's why the U.S. is sending so much in the form of weapons there. They're using the Ukrainian people as a battering ram against Russia. I find it hypocritical. I find it, to be quite frank and blunt, disgusting as an American to see my country doing this, cynically leading to the deaths of people in Ukraine and Russia for the sake of weakening Russia, and then using that as the basis for sending liquefied natural gas from the United States to Europe. As Blinken said yesterday, or 2 days ago, this is a great strategic opportunity for the United States. So is this war really about selling more energy supplies to Europe? I think that shows the hypocrisy and the fraud in the narrative of the West.
Quite understood, and a very good point you have raised. I really do have a lot of questions concerning the topic, but we do have a limited time, so we need to tackle the last topic. South Korea and the United States started conducting missile drills into the sea in response to North Korea's launch of ballistic missile over Japan. The United States asked the UN Security Council to meet on North Korea on Wednesday, but diplomats said China and Russia are opposed to a public discussion by the 15 members body.
The redeployment of the US aircraft carrier on the Korean peninsula is very unusual, and this shows the firm commitment of the South Korea-US alliance to strengthen its readiness against North Korea's consecutive provocations and to respond sternly to North Korean provocations and threats.
The United States condemns these actions and calls on the DPRK to refrain from further unlawful and destabilizing acts. In response to the DPRK's ballistic missile launch over Japan, U.S. Marine Corps fighters joined Japan Air Self-Defense Force fighters in a bilateral exercise over the Sea of Japan on October 4th, Japan time. In addition, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and Republic of Korea personnel conducted a bilateral exercise over the West Sea on October 4th, Korean time. These engagements were taken to showcase combined deterrent and dynamic strike capabilities, while demonstrating the interoperability our nations share.
Very good. So 4 minutes left for us. So let's try to share the time between you and Mr. Howell and Mr. Andre. Mr. Andre, do you think the world is on the brink of another world war? Russia-Ukraine crisis, Armenia, Azerbaijan, North Korea, ongoing rocket stress tests, Iran interventions, NATO expansion eastward. Is this the scenario that is follow another World War III?
I wouldn't go as far as a World War III, but this was de facto a tricky year with a lot of provocations across the globe. Things like the issue with Taiwan that we saw throughout the August, and then now the South-North Korea tension. And besides that, what we also have seen, and this I think is the question of 2022, we have seen a repositioning of the world powers, and we have seen that there is a clear gap between West, what we call the Wide West, with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, aligned with Europe and the USA. But we have also seen the emergence of another bloc with Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Russia aligned in another direction. And then Latin American countries mostly aligned as well with the Global South. So what we are de facto seeing is a new repositioning. It is de facto the end of a unipolarity of the 1990s. And this is leading to a lot of tension and a lot of friction between states. I am still optimistic that we are going to avoid a global scale conflict, but we are de facto seeing some more tension. All the scenarios you've mentioned, plus of course the Kyrgyz-Tajik conflict as well, and the increased tension and coups in Africa, they do show that peace is now more distant than we were expecting 2 or 3 years ago.
Very good indeed. Thank you so much, Mr. Andre. Mr. Howley, as a world analyst that deals with security, what are you saying about this, Mr. Howley? And do you really believe that Russia can use its nuclear arsenal in Ukraine as Medvedev stated? And to some extent, don't you think that the Western allies are pushing Moscow to the limits so we can create another world war?
Well, I think we're seeing what President Putin described in his speech last weekend, the emergence of a new order. And this always happens when an empire, a global power, such as the sole superpower US-NATO alliance, they're losing. And the reason they're losing is because their neoliberal economic policies are destroying their advanced capabilities. And they're trying to compensate for that by taking more from the poor countries, by imposing draconian austerity. And that's why the global South is leaving. It's not Russian propaganda that's making countries anti-American, it's American policy. And this is a policy that's, for the last 50 years, neoliberalism, which benefits the most wealthy, the financial institutions, the bankers, and much of the world is looking for something different. They're looking for the opportunity as sovereign nations to collaborate for the benefit of each other. Now, that's the solution to peace. And if the United States would stop pushing its sole model, saying that everyone has to line up and support our model. This is a model that's not working. And it's not working in Europe either. That's why we're seeing the tension in Europe, not only against the European Union bureaucrats, but against the United States. The solution is work together, negotiate. This was the key to get out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States did negotiate with Nikita Khrushchev and we avoided nuclear war. Something like that has to happen again today. I'm optimistic that it can if the populations in the Western countries start being heard and make it clear they don't want more war and more austerity.
I really would love to continue this fruitful debate with honest replies and answers, but we do have a limited time. Mr. Andrew from Portugal, Mr. Halley from Germany, thank you ever so much for taking part in this discussion. And to this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us in this debate. You can watch again this special coverage on L24 YouTube channel. And for now, take care of yourself. Bye-bye.